Matthew Johnson sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the dim light creeping through the curtains. His military duffel bag lay untouched in the corner of the room, a stark reminder of the life he was trying to leave behind. The war was over for him, at least the physical one, but the battlefield still raged in his mind. It wasn't just the sounds of gunfire that haunted him at night. It was the silence, the kind that had followed him home, the kind that reminded him of Evelyn. Evelyn, his little sister, had vanished 10 years ago. No note, no trace, just gone. The search had consumed him, but after months of dead ends and false leads, Matthew enlisted in the army. He thought maybe, just maybe, the violence of war would drown out the pain. It hadn't. If anything, it had sharpened it, crystallized his sense of failure. He had failed to protect her, and now, even after the battlefield, that failure was the one thing he couldn't escape. His phone buzzed, breaking the quiet. He glanced at the screen. It was a reminder for the charity event he had signed up for at a local orphanage. Matthew had been trying to find new purpose in humanitarian work, throwing himself into causes that helped those without a family, without a home. Maybe by saving others, he could save himself. The orphanage was nestled in a small, sleepy town far from the chaos Matthew had known. He arrived early, the chill in the air biting against his skin as he stepped out of the car. The building was old but well kept, the kind of place that tried to mask its age with freshly painted walls and blooming flower beds. A group of children played in the yard, their laughter a stark contrast to the gnawing unease that had settled in Matthew's stomach since he'd arrived. He walked through the gates, forcing a smile for the children that ran past him, but his mind was elsewhere. Always somewhere else. As he approached the main building, a flash of pink caught his eye. A little girl, no older than 6, was sitting alone on the steps, clutching a small stuffed animal. Matthew froze, his heart skipping a beat. The toy, a faded, worn-out rabbit with one floppy ear, was identical to Evelyn's favorite toy. The toy she had cherished for years before she disappeared. His chest tightened. It couldn't be. He swallowed hard, staring at the girl who hadn't yet noticed him. Memories of Evelyn flooded back in an overwhelming rush. The late nights reading stories, the way she'd fall asleep clutching that very same rabbit. The toy was a piece of Evelyn, of his past, and now it was here, in the hands of a child he didn't know. Matthew's legs carried him forward without thinking. He crouched down to the girl's level, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you get that?" The girl looked up, startled, clutching the toy tighter. Her big, brown eyes blinked at him, unsure whether to trust this stranger. "It's mine," she said softly, her voice barely audible. Matthew's heart pounded in his chest. His hands felt cold, his mind racing. "Who gave it to you?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. The girl stared at him for a moment, then shrugged. "I don't know. I've always had it." His mind swirled with 1,000 questions, but he knew better than to press the child further. He stood up slowly, his gaze never leaving the toy. His breath was shallow, and for the first time in years, hope, a dangerous, fragile thing, began to stir inside him. Could this be a clue? Was Evelyn somehow connected to this place? Just then, a voice cut through the moment. "Claire, it's time to come inside." Matthew turned to see a woman approaching, her eyes warm but tired. She must have been in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. Claire, the little girl, jumped up and ran toward the woman, who knelt down to greet her. As they exchanged a few words, the woman's gaze shifted to Matthew, a curious look on her face. "You must be one of the volunteers," she said, walking toward him with Claire by her side. She extended her hand. "I'm Angela Moore, the social worker here." Matthew forced himself to focus, shaking her hand. "Matthew, I'm here to help with the event today." Angela smiled, though there was a flicker of something more behind her eyes. Maybe she sensed the tension in him, or maybe she'd seen enough troubled souls come through the doors of the orphanage to know when someone was carrying heavy burdens. "Thank you for coming. The kids always appreciate new faces." Matthew nodded, his mind still stuck on the stuffed rabbit. He couldn't shake the image, couldn't let go of the gnawing thought that maybe, just maybe, this place held answers he'd long since given up on finding. As Angela led Claire inside, Matthew lingered a moment longer, staring at the door they disappeared through. His heart raced with the possibilities, but doubt gnawed at him too. Could it really be connected to Evelyn? Or was it just another cruel coincidence? He needed answers. He needed to find out where that toy had come from. And as much as he tried to push the thought away, deep down, Matthew knew he had to follow this thread. If it led him nowhere, so be it. But if it led to Evelyn, then maybe he could finally face the ghosts of his past. One thing was clear. This orphanage had secrets, and Matthew was going to uncover every single one of them. Matthew couldn't shake the image of the rabbit from his mind as he stood by the entrance of the orphanage. The voices of children playing inside felt distant, like background noise, as his thoughts spiraled. That toy wasn't just a coincidence. It couldn't be. His heart raced with a surge of urgency, something he hadn't felt in years. Evelyn was still out there. He had to believe that. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. But the questions kept coming. Who was Claire? Where had she gotten that toy? He needed answers. Angela returned a few minutes later, pulling Matthew out of his thoughts. "Are you ready to help out inside?" she asked, her voice kind but professional. Matthew nodded, though his mind was far from the day's task. As they walked together through the halls of the orphanage, the place felt smaller, more suffocating, now that he knew something, or someone. Here might hold the key to his sister's disappearance. He had spent years searching for clues, combing through police reports, going down endless dead ends. And now, in the most unexpected place, a piece of his past had surfaced. As they entered a room filled with children drawing and playing, Angela gestured for him to follow her to the side, where volunteers were preparing supplies. "You'll be helping with the arts and crafts today," she explained, handing him a box of markers and paper. "The kids love making things to hang on the walls. It gives them a sense of belonging, something to take pride in." Matthew nodded, accepting the box, but his mind wasn't on arts and crafts. His eyes scanned the room, searching for Claire. He spotted her in the corner, sitting quietly, away from the other children. The toy rabbit rested on her lap, and she absent-mindedly stroked its worn-out ear as she stared at a piece of paper, lost in thought. "I couldn't help but notice the little girl, Claire, right?" Matthew asked, trying to keep his voice steady as he spoke to Angela. "She's quiet." Angela glanced over at Claire, then back at Matthew, her face softening. "Yeah, she's been through a lot. She came to us about a year ago. Doesn't talk much about where she came from. We don't press too hard, you know? Some kids just need time." A knot formed in Matthew's stomach. A year ago? That was the first real piece of information he had about Claire. His mind raced with possibilities. Could Evelyn have been nearby? Could she have left the toy here, somehow knowing it would reach him? Matthew forced a smile, trying to mask the storm of emotions brewing beneath the surface. Is there any way to find out more? About her background. I mean, I don't want to intrude, but I've seen kids like her before. Sometimes their stories help them heal. Angela raised an eyebrow, curiosity flashing in her eyes. "You're pretty perceptive, Matthew, but her case is complicated. There's not much information in her file. She was abandoned. No records of family, no next of kin. It's like she appeared out of nowhere." Nowhere? The word hit Matthew like a punch to the gut. The same feeling he had felt when Evelyn vanished. A void. A complete disappearance with no explanation. His thoughts raced back to his sister. She hadn't just disappeared into thin air. Someone had to know something. And maybe, just maybe, Claire was a part of that puzzle. Angela must have noticed the intensity in his expression because she placed a hand on his arm, her tone softening. "I know this kind of work can hit home sometimes. If you ever need to talk about anything, you can trust me." Matthew swallowed hard, nodding. He appreciated the offer, but he wasn't ready to open that door yet. He couldn't. Not until he had answers. "Thanks, Angela. I'll keep that in mind." They both turned back to the children, but Matthew couldn't focus. He needed more time with Claire, needed to understand how that toy had ended up in her hands. He found himself walking over to her, unsure of what he was going to say, but feeling pulled toward her by something stronger than curiosity, hope. "Hi, Claire," he said softly, crouching down to her level. She looked up, her eyes wide and uncertain, but she didn't speak. I see you've got a cool toy there. The rabbit. It looks like it's been with you for a long time. Claire's grip on the toy tightened, and she looked away, avoiding his gaze. I had someone close to me who had a rabbit just like that, Matthew continued, keeping his voice gentle, as though talking to her was as delicate as defusing a bomb. Her name was Evelyn. She was my sister. At the mention of his sister, Claire's eyes flickered with something. Recognition, maybe? Or was it fear? Matthew's heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. Was he reaching her? Was this the connection he'd been chasing for a decade? You remind me of her, he added quietly, unsure if he was trying to coax a response or simply reassuring himself. Claire's lips parted, but she stayed silent for a moment, as if weighing whether or not she could trust him. Finally, she whispered, "The rabbit was in the room when I came here." Matthew froze, his breath catching. "In the room?" he echoed, his mind racing. "You mean it was already here when you arrived?" Claire nodded, her small hands trembling as she held the toy closer. "It was waiting for me." A chill ran down Matthew's spine. The toy had been at the orphanage, waiting. For whom? For her? For him? His thoughts tumbled over each other in a chaotic rush. If Evelyn had left that toy, how could she have known he would find it? How could she have known about Claire? His pulse quickened as he struggled to make sense of it all. His instinct screamed at him to dig deeper, to find out more, but Claire was just a child. He couldn't push her too hard, couldn't risk scaring her away. "Do you remember anything else about where you came from?" Matthew asked, his voice barely above a whisper, afraid the wrong word might break the fragile connection he had with her. But Claire shook her head, her eyes clouding over. "No, I don't remember." Matthew's heart sank. He wanted to believe she was telling the truth, but something told him there was more. Something deeper. And now, more than ever, he was convinced that his sister's fate and Claire's past were intertwined. He stood up slowly, forcing a smile. "Thanks for talking to me, Claire. I'm glad we met." Claire didn't respond, just clutched the rabbit tighter as she watched him walk away. Matthew's mind churned with possibilities, each one more improbable than the last. He had come here for a volunteer event, but now he was walking away with a mission, one that he couldn't ignore. Angela approached him again, this time with a more serious expression. "Is everything okay?" she asked, concern etched into her features. Matthew hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, I need to look into something. I think there's more going on here than we realize." Angela studied him for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "If you need help with anything, let me know. I've seen a lot of strange things working here over the years. Sometimes, things aren't always what they seem." Matthew's jaw tightened. "I might take you up on that. I'm going to need all the help I can get." As he walked out of the orphanage, his thoughts swirled. He had no idea where this path was leading him, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't leaving this town until he uncovered the truth about Claire and what really happened to Evelyn. Matthew drove away from the orphanage, his mind a storm of questions. The rabbit, the toy that had belonged to Evelyn, was the thread tying everything together, but how? Claire's quiet words echoed in his mind. "It was waiting for me." What did that mean? How could it have been there, waiting for her, when she had no connection to Evelyn? Or so it seemed. The road stretched out ahead of him, but Matthew was too deep in thought to notice the scenery passing by. His hands gripped the steering wheel as his pulse quickened. For years, he tried to put his past behind him, but now the past was creeping back into his life in the form of a little girl and a toy he thought he'd never see again. He pulled into his driveway, turned off the engine, and sat in silence for a moment, staring blankly at the house. The weight of the day pressed down on him. He had come to the orphanage looking for purpose, for a way to help others and maybe find some peace. But now, all he could think about was Evelyn. He stepped out of the car and made his way inside, the familiar creak of the front door doing little to soothe his racing thoughts. The house felt empty, hollow, much like his life had felt ever since Evelyn's disappearance. He walked into the living room, dropped onto the couch, and buried his face in his hands. Why now? Why this toy? His phone buzzed, startling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Angela. I've been thinking about what you said earlier. If you want to take a look at Claire's file, I can arrange that. Maybe it'll help answer some of your questions. Matthew hesitated for a moment, then quickly typed back, "That would be great. Let me know when." He knew it was a long shot, but there was no other way to move forward. If Claire's file had any clues about how she ended up at the orphanage, or where that toy came from, he needed to see it. But there was more to this than just paperwork. He needed to see Claire again, to understand how she was connected to Evelyn, if she was connected at all. The thought that he might finally be close to answers after years of searching made his chest tighten with both anticipation and fear. What if this led to another dead end? What if it didn't? The next morning, Matthew returned to the orphanage. The air was crisp, the sky overcast, as if the weather itself could sense the heaviness of what lay ahead. Angela was waiting for him in the office, a manila folder in her hands. "I pulled Claire's file like you asked," she said, handing it over to him. Her expression was calm, but Matthew could tell she was curious about why he was so insistent on digging into Claire's past. He opened the folder, flipping through the sparse information inside. There were the basics: her name, estimated age, the date she was found abandoned. But there was almost nothing about her origins. No birth records, no previous addresses. It was as if she had appeared out of thin air, just like Angela had said. "Is this really all there is?" Matthew asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Angela nodded. "I know it's not much. Most of the kids who come through here don't have a lot of history with them, especially when they're abandoned. It's heartbreaking, but it's the reality we deal with." Matthew stared at the file, a sinking feeling in his gut. "And the toy? There's no mention of it?" Angela frowned slightly. "No, but now that you mention it, I remember seeing it with her from the first day she arrived. The staff assumed it was hers." Matthew closed the folder, his jaw clenched. That toy was the key. He just didn't know how it fit into the puzzle yet. "I need to know where she came from," Matthew said, his voice low. "There has to be more." Angela studied him for a long moment. "Matthew, why is this so important to you? I've seen you with the kids. You care about them, I can tell. But this," she gestured to the folder, "this feels personal." He hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. But he couldn't keep holding it in. Not anymore. "Claire's toy," he began, his voice steady but strained. "It belonged to my sister, Evelyn. She disappeared 10 years ago, and that toy was with her when she vanished. Seeing it again, it's like the past coming back to haunt me." Angela's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and understanding. "Oh my God. Matthew, I had no idea. I'm so sorry." He shook his head. "I'm not looking for sympathy. I'm looking for answers. That toy is the only real clue I've had in years. And now, somehow, it's with Claire. I need to know how." Angela was silent for a moment, processing everything. Then she sighed. "If that toy really is connected to your sister, then we need to find out how Claire got it. But there's nothing here in the records that will help." Matthew nodded. "Then I need to talk to her again. Maybe she knows more than she realizes." Angela seemed hesitant, but eventually nodded. "All right, I'll arrange for you to spend some more time with her. But be careful, Matthew. Claire's been through a lot, and pushing too hard might scare her." "I understand," Matthew replied. "I'll take it slow." Later that afternoon, Matthew found himself back in the playroom, where Claire sat at a small table coloring with a few other kids. He watched her for a moment, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this innocent child might hold the key to the mystery that had consumed his life. He approached her slowly, taking a seat across from her. She glanced up at him but didn't say anything, her focus on her coloring. "Hey, Claire," he said softly. "Do you remember me? From yesterday?" She nodded, but her eyes stayed on the paper in front of her. "I was wondering," Matthew continued, "about the rabbit you have. The toy. Do you like it?" Claire paused, her crayon hovering above the paper. "Yes," she whispered. Matthew smiled gently. "It's a special toy, isn't it?" She nodded again, her fingers tightening around the crayon. "Do you ever wonder where it came from?" he asked, keeping his tone light, though his heart was pounding. Claire was silent for a long time, her small face scrunched in concentration as if trying to remember. "It was here," she finally said, her voice barely audible. When I came, it was waiting for me. Matthew felt a chill run down his spine. Do you remember anything from before you came here? Anyone who might have left it for you? Claire shook her head, her expression clouding over with confusion. No, I don't remember. Matthew's chest tightened. He was close, but not close enough. He had to be careful, had to keep her trust. That's okay, he said softly. Maybe one day you'll remember. And if you do, you can tell me, all right? Claire nodded, her attention already drifting back to her drawing. Matthew stood, his mind swirling. He hadn't gotten the answers he was hoping for, but there was no turning back now. The toy was here for a reason, and he wasn't going to stop until he uncovered the truth. As he left the orphanage, Angela caught up with him outside. So, she asked, searching his face, did you find out anything? Matthew exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. Not much, but I'm not giving up. Angela nodded, her expression serious. We'll figure this out, one way or another. Matthew looked back at the orphanage, his heart heavy but his resolve unshaken. He was getting closer. He could feel it, and he wasn't going to stop until he found out what really happened to Evelyn. The following morning, Matthew awoke early, the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on him. His mind was consumed by the toy and Claire's vague responses. He couldn't ignore the growing certainty that the toy was more than a coincidence. It was a sign, a thread linking the girl, the orphanage, and Evelyn's disappearance. But without more concrete information, he felt like he was grasping at shadows. Determined to push forward, Matthew made his way back to the orphanage. The day was overcast, matching his mood. As he approached the building, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Angela. Can we talk? Meet me in the office when you get here. I think I have an idea. Intrigued, Matthew quickened his pace, entering the orphanage with renewed focus. Angela was already waiting for him, seated behind her desk with a file open in front of her. She looked up as he entered, her expression serious but hopeful. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, she began, motioning for him to sit. About your sister, about Claire's toy. I'm not usually one to dig too deep into a kid's background unless it's necessary, but something about this whole situation doesn't feel right. Matthew sat down, his heart pounding in anticipation. What do you mean? Angela leaned forward, lowering her voice as though someone might be listening. There are too many gaps in Claire's story. I've worked in this system for years, Matthew, and it's rare that a child comes in with so little information. No birth certificate, no family history. It's like she appeared out of nowhere. Matthew nodded, his pulse quickening. That's exactly what I've been feeling. I know it sounds crazy, but I can't shake the feeling that Evelyn is connected to this. That toy, it belonged to her. And if there's even a chance that it could lead me to her, I have to follow it. Angela studied him for a long moment, as if weighing her next words carefully. Finally, she sighed. I want to help you, Matthew. I really do. But we can't just barge in and start asking questions without raising red flags. Claire is a vulnerable kid, and we need to be careful. I get that, Matthew said, his voice tight with frustration. But what do we do? How do we find out more without making things worse for her? Angela opened the file in front of her and pushed it toward him. There's one thing we haven't tried yet, she said, her eyes locking with his. Claire was abandoned outside of a hospital in a small town about 30 miles from here. It's a dead-end lead in her file because there was no identifying information, but maybe, just maybe, someone there remembers something. Matthew's heart leaped. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The hospital? Do you think they might have records? Security footage? Angela shrugged. It's possible, but even if they don't, it's worth checking out. If Evelyn had something to do with Claire's arrival, someone might have seen her. Matthew felt a surge of gratitude toward Angela. She had no reason to help him, no personal stake in Evelyn's disappearance, but she was taking a risk by getting involved. Thank you, he said, his voice filled with sincerity. I don't know what I'd do without your help. Angela smiled, though there was a sadness behind her eyes. I know what it's like to lose someone, Matthew. If there's even a chance you can find your sister, I want to help. The two shared a quiet moment, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. Finally, Angela stood, breaking the silence. Let's head to the hospital. I'll drive. The hospital wasn't far, but the drive felt long, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The small, rural facility sat at the edge of town, its exterior unremarkable and weathered by time. As they pulled into the parking lot, Matthew felt a knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. He had followed so many leads over the years, so many dead ends, that part of him was bracing for disappointment. Angela led the way inside, her calm demeanor steadying Matthew's nerves. They approached the reception desk, where an older woman with glasses perched on her nose greeted them with a polite but disinterested smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, glancing between them. Angela stepped forward. "Hi, I'm Angela Moore from the Crestwood Orphanage. We're here about a child that was left outside this hospital about a year ago. Her name is Claire." The woman blinked, clearly trying to recall the event. "Claire?" she repeated, before recognition sparked in her eyes. "Oh, yes, I remember now. Poor thing. She was just left on the doorstep like a package. It was the strangest thing." Matthew's heart raced. "Do you remember anything else? Was there anyone around? Anyone suspicious?" The receptionist frowned, tapping her fingers on the desk as she thought. "Well, I wasn't here that night, but I do remember the security guard mentioning something odd. He said he thought he saw a woman lingering near the entrance before the child was found. But by the time he went to check, she was gone." Matthew felt a surge of hope. A woman? Did he see her face? Was there anything unusual about her? The woman shook her head apologetically. "I don't think he got a good look. It was dark, and she was keeping to the shadows. But I can pull the security footage from that night, if it hasn't been erased yet." Matthew exchanged a glance with Angela, barely able to contain his anticipation. "Please, that would be a huge help." The receptionist nodded and disappeared into a back room, leaving them standing in the quiet, sterile lobby. Matthew's thoughts were racing, 1,000 possibilities running through his mind. Could the woman have been Evelyn? Could she have been watching, waiting, before disappearing into the night? His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he tried to keep his emotions in check. A few minutes later, the receptionist returned, holding a USB drive. "Here it is," she said, handing it over to Angela. "I'm not sure what you'll find, but you're welcome to look." Angela took the drive, her expression serious. "Thank you. We appreciate it." They left the hospital in silence, the weight of what they might find hanging over them. As soon as they got back to the car, Angela plugged the drive into her laptop, her fingers trembling slightly as she clicked through the files. The grainy footage from that night played out on the screen. At first, there was nothing, just the empty hospital entrance, the shadows flickering under the dim streetlights. Then, suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the frame. Matthew leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman was barely visible, her face obscured by the shadows, but there was something hauntingly familiar about her posture, the way she moved with a kind of nervous energy. She lingered by the entrance for a few seconds, glancing around as if making sure no one was watching. Then, she bent down, and a small bundle, Claire, appeared in her arms. Matthew's breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be, could it? The woman placed Claire gently on the ground, her movements slow and deliberate, before she stepped back into the shadows. She paused for a moment, looking down at the child, before disappearing into the night. Matthew sat back, his pulse racing. "It's her. It has to be." Angela's face was pale as she stared at the screen. "Matthew, we can't know for sure. The footage is too blurry." But Matthew's mind was already spinning. He knew that posture, that hesitation. His gut told him it was Evelyn. She had been there. She had left Claire. But why? Why wouldn't she have come back to him? Why disappear all over again? His head swam with questions, but one thing was clear. He was closer than ever. Evelyn was alive, and she had left Claire behind for a reason. Now, more than ever, he had to find her. As they drove back to the orphanage, Angela broke the silence. "Matthew, I don't know where this is leading, but I'm with you. We'll figure it out." Matthew nodded, his resolve hardening. "I know, and I'm not stopping until I do." As Matthew and Angela drove back to the orphanage, the weight of what they had just seen hung heavy in the air. The blurry footage from the hospital played over and over in Matthew's mind, every detail scrutinized, every movement analyzed. He was sure of it. The woman was Evelyn. Even if he couldn't make out her face, something in his gut told him that his sister had been there, leaving Claire behind in the dead of night. But why? Why would Evelyn abandon a child? And why hadn't she reached out to him? The questions gnawed at him as they pulled into the orphanage parking lot. Angela shut off the engine and turned to Matthew, her expression serious but compassionate. "I can see this is hitting you hard. I want you to know, whatever happens, you don't have to do this alone." Matthew nodded, grateful for her support, but his mind was racing too fast to dwell on it. "I appreciate that, but right now, I need answers." Angela sighed, clearly concerned for him, but she knew better than to push. "Let's go inside. Maybe we can talk to Claire again, see if anything else jogs her memory." They walked into the orphanage together, the warm hum of children's laughter and activity greeting them at the door. But for Matthew, the noise felt distant, almost surreal, like a world he no longer fit into. His thoughts were too consumed by the possibility that his sister was out there, alive, but still unreachable. Angela led the way to the playroom, where Claire was sitting at a small table, quietly coloring. She looked up as they approached, her eyes meeting Matthew's for just a second before dropping back to her paper. The stuffed rabbit, Evelyn's rabbit, sat beside her on the table. "Hi, Claire," Angela said softly, crouching down to the girl's level. "How are you today?" Claire shrugged, her attention focused on her drawing. Matthew glanced over Angela's shoulder, watching the child's small hand move methodically over the paper, creating a mess of tangled lines. But something about the drawing caught his eye, something familiar. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just random scribbles. Claire was drawing a house. Matthew's breath hitched as he leaned forward, his pulse quickening. The shape of the house, it was almost identical to the one he and Evelyn had grown up in. He could see the slanted roof, the two large front windows, the small garden out front. Claire couldn't possibly know about that house. Unless... "Claire," Matthew said gently, trying to keep his voice calm, "that's a nice drawing. Can you tell me about it?" The little girl hesitated, her eyes flicking to the rabbit before she spoke. "It's a house," she said quietly. "I see that," Matthew replied, forcing a smile. "Is it a house you've been to before?" Claire's hand stilled over the paper, her expression clouding with uncertainty. "I think so. I'm not sure." Matthew's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced at Angela, who nodded slightly, encouraging him to continue. "Claire, do you remember who was with you at the house?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "Was there someone there? Someone who looked after you?" For a long moment, Claire didn't answer. She just stared at the drawing, her fingers gripping the crayon tightly. Then, slowly, she nodded. "There was a lady," she whispered. "She was nice. She gave me the rabbit." Matthew's throat tightened. His palms felt clammy, and he struggled to keep his composure. Was the lady's name Evelyn? Claire blinked, her brow furrowing in concentration. "I don't know her name," she said softly, "but she told me to keep the rabbit safe. She said it was special." Matthew sat back, his mind reeling. Evelyn had been there. She had given Claire the rabbit. The very same toy that had once been a symbol of comfort for his sister now passed on to a girl she had abandoned. But why? What had happened? Angela spoke up, her voice gentle. "Claire, do you remember where the house was? Was it close by or far away?" The little girl shook her head, her small face scrunched in frustration. "I don't know. I don't remember much. Just the lady in the house." Matthew swallowed hard, fighting back the surge of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. He was so close, closer than he had been in years, but the answers still felt just out of reach. Angela stood and placed a comforting hand on Matthew's shoulder. "It's okay," she said softly. "This is progress. We're getting somewhere." Matthew nodded, though his mind was still spinning. He thanked Claire and watched as she went back to her coloring, her focus shifting away from the conversation as if nothing had happened. But for Matthew, everything had changed. The rabbit, the house, the woman, Evelyn. He was certain of it now. His sister had left Claire with that toy for a reason. It was a message, a breadcrumb trail, and he had to follow it. Later that evening, Matthew sat in his car in front of the orphanage, staring at the setting sun as it cast long shadows across the parking lot. He had been sitting there for nearly an hour, lost in thought, trying to piece together the fragments of information Claire had given him. The house. That was the key. If he could figure out where the house was, he could find Evelyn. He was sure of it. His phone buzzed on the seat beside him, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Angela. "You okay? It looked like today hit you hard." Matthew sighed, typing back quickly, "Yeah, just thinking." The house Claire drew. It looked like mine. From when I was a kid. A few seconds passed before Angela replied, "That's a strange coincidence, don't you think? Maybe you should go back there. To the house. See if it stirs anything up." Matthew's breath caught in his throat. Go back? He hadn't been to the house since he left it behind after Evelyn disappeared. The thought of returning filled him with a sense of dread, but also hope. Maybe Angela was right. Maybe going back would unlock something he had buried deep in his mind. Before he could second-guess himself, Matthew typed out a reply, "I'll go tomorrow." He hit send and immediately felt the weight of the decision settle over him. It was time to face the past head-on. The next morning, Matthew found himself driving along the winding road that led back to his childhood home. The house was still there, nestled at the edge of a dense forest, its once vibrant exterior now faded and weathered. As he pulled into the driveway, memories flooded back. Memories of him and Evelyn playing in the front yard, of their mother calling them in for dinner, of the day she disappeared. The house felt frozen in time, untouched by the years that had passed since he last stood there. Matthew got out of the car and walked slowly toward the front door, his heart pounding in his chest. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and the familiar scent of old wood and dust greeted him. The inside of the house was just as he remembered it. Furniture draped in white sheets, the silence thick and heavy. He walked through the rooms, each one stirring memories he had long tried to forget. And then he saw it. In the corner of the living room, tucked away on a small table, was a photograph. Matthew picked it up, his hands trembling. It was a picture of him and Evelyn, taken just weeks before she disappeared. They were smiling, standing in front of the house, Evelyn clutching the rabbit in her arms. Matthew's heart clenched as he stared at the photo. Evelyn had been here. She had left clues. He was sure of it now. But what did it all mean? Why had she disappeared? Why had she left Claire with the rabbit? His phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. It was Angela. "Did you find anything?" Matthew stared at the photo, his mind racing. He typed back, "Yeah, I think I'm onto something. I just need more time." As he stood there, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, Matthew knew one thing for certain. The answers he sought were closer than ever, and he wasn't going to stop until he uncovered the truth. Matthew sat on the porch of his childhood home, the photograph of him and Evelyn resting in his lap. The faded edges of the picture seemed to mirror his fractured memories of that time, a past he had long tried to suppress. But now, with the rabbit, the house, and Claire all swirling together, it was impossible to keep the floodgates closed. The past was rushing back in, forcing him to confront what he had spent years trying to forget. He stared out at the forest that bordered the property, the thick trees casting long shadows in the fading light of the afternoon. This house had once been a place of safety, a sanctuary from the world. But now, it felt haunted by memories, by the ghosts of what had happened here. As a child, Matthew had never understood why Evelyn disappeared. One night, she was there, laughing, playing, and the next, she was gone. His parents had been devastated, their grief swallowing the family whole. Matthew had blamed himself, convinced that if he had been more attentive, more protective, he could have saved her. Those thoughts had chased him into adulthood, driving him to the military, to war, to a life where the pain might be easier to bear if it was surrounded by the noise of combat. But the noise never drowned out the guilt. And now, it was all coming back. His phone vibrated in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Angela. Any news? Did the house reveal anything? Matthew stared at the message, unsure of how to respond. The photograph was proof that Evelyn had been here, but it wasn't enough. He needed more than just a memory frozen in time. He needed to know why she had left, and where she had gone. He typed back quickly, "I found an old photo of Evelyn and me here. It's a clue, but not enough. I think I need to talk to someone who remembers." Angela's reply came almost instantly. "Who are you thinking?" Matthew's fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he responded, "My parents." His stomach twisted at the thought of seeing them again. It had been years since they last spoke. After Evelyn disappeared, his family had fractured. His father sinking into a quiet, distant grief, and his mother retreating into a world of denial. Matthew had distanced himself, unable to handle the pain, the blame, the overwhelming silence that filled their home. But now, with Claire, the rabbit, and the photograph, he knew he couldn't avoid them any longer. His parents might hold the missing piece of the puzzle, something they had never told him, something they had kept buried with their grief. Angela's reply was simple but supportive. "You need to do this. Call me if you need anything." Matthew slipped the phone back into his pocket and took a deep breath. It was time to confront the past he had been running from for so long. Later that evening, Matthew pulled into the driveway of his parents' house. It hadn't changed much over the years. The same white picket fence, the same flower beds his mother had tended to with such care. But now, everything looked slightly more worn, more tired, as if time had taken its toll not just on the house, but on the people inside it. He hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the doorbell. What would they say? Would they even talk to him? Taking a deep breath, he pressed the bell and listened to the faint chime echo inside the house. A few moments later, the door creaked open, and his mother stood in the doorway, her face a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. She looked older than he remembered, her once bright eyes dimmed by years of heartache. "Matthew," she said softly, as if testing the sound of his name on her lips. "Hi, Mom," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. I need to talk to you. About Evelyn." Her expression shifted immediately, the name triggering something deep within her. She stepped aside, motioning for him to come in, though her movements were stiff, as if she wasn't sure she wanted to hear what he had to say. Inside, the house smelled the same, familiar, yet distant. His father sat in the living room, a newspaper spread out on his lap, but when he saw Matthew enter, he set it aside and stood, his face etched with surprise. "Matthew," his father said, his voice heavy with the weight of years past. "It's been a long time." Matthew nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, it has." There was an awkward silence as they all stood there, the elephant in the room, the ghost of Evelyn, hovering between them. Finally, his mother broke the silence. "You said you wanted to talk about Evelyn," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Matthew nodded again, his chest tight. "Yes, I think I'm close to finding out what happened to her." His father's eyes widened, and his mother's hand flew to her mouth, as if she was trying to hold back something she had buried long ago. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Matthew pulled the photograph from his pocket, handing it to her. "This was taken just before she disappeared. I found it in the old house." His mother took the picture, her fingers trembling as she looked at it. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she said nothing, handing the photo to his father, who studied it in silence. "I found a girl, Mom. Her name is Claire. She was abandoned, and she has Evelyn's toy, the rabbit, the same one from this picture." Matthew's voice grew more urgent, the weight of the revelation heavy on him. "I think Evelyn gave it to her. I think she's been trying to send me a message." His parents exchanged a glance, their faces pale. His father cleared his throat, his voice strained. "Matthew, there are things we never told you about Evelyn." Matthew's heart raced. This was it, the truth he had been searching for, the missing piece. His mother wiped her eyes, her voice shaky as she spoke. "Before Evelyn disappeared, she was scared. She told us someone was following her. We thought it was just a phase, maybe a teenage imagination. But then, she was gone." Matthew felt the air leave his lungs. "Why didn't you tell me this?" "We didn't know what to think," his father said quietly. "We thought she ran away. We thought maybe it was our fault, that we weren't there for her." His mother's tears flowed freely now, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought I was protecting you, Matthew. I thought telling you would only make it worse. But I never stopped looking for her. I never stopped hoping she'd come back. Matthew's mind was spinning. Someone had been following Evelyn. That meant her disappearance hadn't been a random act. It was deliberate. And now, with Claire in the picture, it was all starting to make sense. Whoever had been after Evelyn hadn't stopped. They had found her, forced her into hiding, and she had left Claire as a clue, hoping that Matthew would find her. He stood, pacing the room as the pieces fell into place. So, she didn't just run away, he muttered, more to himself than to his parents. She was trying to protect herself, maybe even protect us. His father nodded slowly. That's what we believe. But after all these years, we had no leads. We didn't know where she was, or if she was even alive. Matthew's chest tightened with both relief and despair. He was closer to understanding what had happened, but the truth only brought more questions. Where was Evelyn now? Who had been following her? And how was Claire involved? His mother reached out, her voice soft. Matthew, if you found something, anything that could lead to Evelyn, you have to follow it. He looked at her, the raw emotion in her eyes mirroring the pain he had carried for so long. I will, he promised. I'm not stopping until I find her. As Matthew left his parents' house, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He had uncovered something crucial, a dark truth that had been hidden from him for years. But now, with the knowledge that Evelyn had been in danger, his mission had changed. It wasn't just about finding her anymore. It was about saving her, wherever she was. The shadows of his past had resurfaced, but now Matthew was ready to face them head-on. Evelyn was out there, and he was closer than ever to bringing her home. The drive back from his parents' house was a blur for Matthew. The revelations about Evelyn, about someone following her before she disappeared, had rattled him to the core. His mind replayed his mother's tearful confession and his father's somber words, filling in pieces of a puzzle he never knew existed. But the puzzle wasn't complete. Not yet. He couldn't stop thinking about Claire, the little girl with Evelyn's toy, the child who had somehow become a key to unraveling his sister's fate. Matthew's gut told him there was more to Claire's story than anyone knew. Someone had been after Evelyn, and now, with Claire in the picture, he feared that same threat might still be lurking. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. As Matthew pulled into the orphanage parking lot, the sun had already begun to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the building. His pulse quickened as he made his way inside, his mind racing with possibilities. Angela had promised to help him dig deeper into Claire's background, and now, more than ever, he needed her support. He found her in her office, sorting through files. She looked up as he entered, her face immediately softening with concern. "You okay?" she asked, setting the papers aside. "How did it go with your parents?" Matthew sat down across from her, running a hand through his hair. "It was hard," he admitted, his voice tight. "But I learned something important. Before Evelyn disappeared, she told my parents someone was following her. She was scared, and then she was gone." Angela's eyes widened, the weight of his words sinking in. "So, it wasn't just a random disappearance?" Matthew shook his head. "No, whoever was after her, they're the reason she vanished. And now, I think they're tied to Claire. There's no other explanation for how Evelyn's rabbit ended up with her." Angela leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. "If that's true, then Claire could be in danger. We need to find out who left her at the hospital and why." Matthew nodded, his heart pounding. "Do you have any leads? Anything we can use?" Angela reached for a file on her desk, the one containing Claire's scant background information. "I've been going through what little we have on Claire, and there's something odd. The documents we received when she was brought to the orphanage, they were incomplete. Usually, even abandoned children have basic information attached. Hospital records, a birth certificate, something. But with Claire, there's nothing. It's like someone went out of their way to erase her identity." A chill ran down Matthew's spine. "So, someone wanted her to disappear, just like Evelyn." Angela nodded, her face pale. "It looks that way. I think Claire's past is being hidden, but I don't know by who or why." The knot in Matthew's stomach tightened. He had been right all along. Claire was at the center of something much bigger, and whatever it was, It had swallowed Evelyn whole. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what it all meant, but the more he thought about it, the more it felt like he was staring into a void. "Matthew," Angela said softly, breaking the tense silence, "I've been doing some digging of my own. There's something you need to see." She pulled out another file and opened it, revealing a folded piece of paper. "It's a letter," she explained. "We found it in Claire's belongings when she first arrived. I didn't think much of it at the time, but after everything you've told me, I think this might be connected to Evelyn." Matthew's heart pounded in his chest as he took the letter from her hands, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was familiar, too familiar. His throat tightened as he recognized the slanted, hurried scrawl of his sister's penmanship. "Matthew, if you're reading this, it means you found Claire. I'm sorry I had to disappear. I did it to protect us, to protect you. There are people after me, people who won't stop until they get what they want. Claire is part of this now, and you need to keep her safe. I couldn't leave without making sure you knew the truth. I love you, Evelyn." Matthew stared at the letter, his hands trembling. It was real. Evelyn had written this. She was alive, or at least she had been when she left the letter with Claire. His mind raced with 1,000 questions, each one more frantic than the last. "She was trying to protect me," Matthew whispered, his voice hoarse. "She was protecting both of us." Angela's face was grim. "Matthew, if these people are still out there, Claire might be in serious danger. And if they knew Evelyn was hiding her, we need to find them," Matthew said, his voice hardening with determination. "Whoever these people are, they're not just a threat to Evelyn. They're a threat to Claire, and I won't let them get to her." Angela nodded, her expression steely. "We'll figure this out. Together." The following day, Matthew and Angela began their search in earnest. They started by going through every piece of information they could find about Claire's arrival at the hospital, but as Angela had suspected, there were no concrete records. Everything seemed to point to one conclusion. Someone had orchestrated her abandonment, covering their tracks too carefully for it to be a coincidence. They scoured the area near the hospital, interviewing anyone who might remember the night Claire was found. A few vague recollections surfaced: a nurse who remembered seeing a woman in the shadows, a security guard who had noticed a car parked outside for hours, but no one had seen the woman's face. Every lead was a dead end. Every step forward another reminder of how elusive the truth had become. As the days passed, Matthew's frustration grew. The more they searched, the more it felt like they were running in circles. But one thing kept him going: Evelyn's letter. It was proof that she had tried to protect him, that she had left Claire behind for a reason. And if he could just find out who these people were, who had been after her, he might finally bring her home. Late one night, after hours of fruitless searching, Matthew sat in his car outside the orphanage, the letter crumpled in his hand. His mind was racing, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. The woman in the shadows, the car parked outside, the erased records. It all pointed to someone powerful, someone with the resources to make people disappear. Then it hit him. What if Evelyn didn't just run away? What if she was forced to? The thought sent a jolt of fear through his body. If Evelyn had been taken, if she was still in danger, then whoever had been after her was still out there. And now, they might be coming for Claire. He jumped out of the car, his heart pounding in his chest, and rushed inside the orphanage. Angela was still there, sorting through files, and she looked up in surprise as he burst into the office. "Angela," he said, breathless. "What if Evelyn didn't disappear on her own? What if she was taken?" Angela's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" Matthew paced the room, his mind racing. "Think about it. The erased records, the people following her, Claire being abandoned with no trace of her past. Someone is covering their tracks, and I think they're the same people who took Evelyn." Angela's face paled as she processed his words. "But why? What do they want with her? And why leave Claire behind?" "I don't know," Matthew admitted, his voice tight. "But I think Evelyn knew something dangerous. And now, they're trying to erase her." Angela stood, her face set with determination. "Then we need to find out who they are, before they come for Claire." Matthew nodded, his resolve hardening. He was closer than ever to finding the truth, but the stakes had never been higher. Whoever these people were, they were powerful, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But neither would Matthew. He wouldn't stop until he found Evelyn and protected Claire from the shadows closing in around them. Matthew's mind raced as he and Angela sat in her office late into the night, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. The tension was palpable. They were close, so close to uncovering the truth, but the weight of it pressed heavily on both of them. Whoever had taken Evelyn, whoever had left Claire behind, was still out there, and the more they uncovered, the more dangerous it felt. Angela broke the silence, her voice steady but low. If Evelyn was taken, then she's been running for a long time. Whoever these people are, they've kept her on the move. But why? What are they trying to hide? Matthew sat back in his chair, exhaustion creeping into his bones. I don't know, he admitted. But whatever it is, Evelyn is the key. And now, Claire is part of it too. Angela nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. We need to track down the woman mentioned in the hospital records, the one seen dropping Claire off. If we can figure out who she is, we might find out where Evelyn has been all this time. Matthew's chest tightened at the thought. He had spent years searching for answers, and now they were right on the edge of a breakthrough. But he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every moment they wasted was another moment that Evelyn, and now Claire, could be in danger. Angela pulled out her laptop and started typing. I've got a few contacts who work in law enforcement, she said. They might be able to help us identify the woman. If we're lucky, they can track down her movements from the hospital that night. Matthew nodded, feeling a surge of hope. Do it. The next few hours passed in a blur as Angela made calls, digging deeper into the information they had on Claire's arrival. Matthew paced the room, restless, his thoughts spiraling as he imagined where Evelyn might be now. Was she still on the run? Was she being held somewhere, forced into silence by the people who had taken her? His mind wandered to Claire, wondering how much of this she understood. She was just a child, yet she was tangled in a web of lies and danger far bigger than she could comprehend. As dawn approached, Angela finally hung up the phone, her expression grim. I've got something, she said, her voice tight. The woman who dropped Claire off? Her name is Sophia Lang. She's got a history, falsified documents, multiple aliases. She's been involved in some shady dealings for years. Matthew's heart pounded in his chest. What kind of dealings? Angela glanced at her notes, her brow furrowing. Mostly fraud, but there's more. She's connected to a group that's been involved in illegal trafficking, people, information, you name it. It's possible she's been working for someone who wanted Claire and Evelyn off the grid. A cold chill ran down Matthew's spine. Trafficking? The word sent a wave of nausea through him. Was Evelyn part of something darker than he had imagined? Was Claire a victim too? Angela nodded, her face grim. It gets worse. Sophia's been off the radar for a few years, but recently, there have been sightings of her in the same towns Evelyn was last seen in. Matthew's breath caught. So, she's still involved in this? She's still out there? Angela sighed. It looks that way. And if she's involved, then whoever's behind this operation isn't just after Evelyn. They're after something bigger. Matthew's thoughts raced. He couldn't let this continue. He had to find Sophia, had to find out what she knew about Evelyn and Claire. But as he stood there, the weight of the situation settled over him like a suffocating fog. He was up against something much larger than he had anticipated. An organized, dangerous group with the power to make people disappear. And now, it was up to him and Angela to stop them. We need to find Sophia, Matthew said, his voice hard with determination. She's the key. If we can get to her, we can figure out where Evelyn is. Angela nodded, already moving to her computer. I've got a few leads on where she might be. I'll reach out to my contacts and see if we can narrow it down. It didn't take long before Angela's contacts came through. Sophia had been spotted in a nearby city, staying under the radar but still making waves in the underground scene. The moment they got the lead, Matthew and Angela were on the road, the tension between them palpable as they sped toward the city. The drive was quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts. Matthew's mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Who were these people after Evelyn? What did they want with her? And why had she involved Claire in the first place? When they arrived in the city, Angela directed Matthew to a seedy part of town, where rundown buildings and graffiti-lined walls loomed around them. It was the kind of place where people kept their heads down and didn't ask questions, exactly the kind of place someone like Sophia would hide. They parked a few blocks away from the building where Sophia was rumored to be staying, the tension between them growing as they approached. Angela had a plan. They'd pose as people looking to get involved in one of her schemes, hoping it would give them a way in. Matthew's heart pounded with every step they took toward the building, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on him. When they reached the door, Angela knocked, her face calm but determined. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a woman with sharp eyes and a guarded expression. Matthew recognized her immediately from the descriptions. Sophia Lang. "You're not supposed to be here," Sophia said, her voice low and dangerous. "We're here to talk," Angela replied smoothly, stepping forward. "We know about the girl you left at the hospital, Claire." Sophia's eyes flickered with recognition, but she didn't let it show on her face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Matthew said, stepping forward, his voice tight with anger. "Claire, Evelyn's rabbit, everything. We know you were involved. We know you're working for someone." Sophia's expression darkened, and for a moment, Matthew thought she might slam the door in their faces. But then, to his surprise, she sighed and stepped aside. "Fine, come in, but you're not going to like what you hear." Inside, the apartment was sparse, the air heavy with the smell of cigarette smoke and something else, fear. Sophia sat down on a worn-out couch, crossing her arms as she studied them. "You want to know about Claire?" she said, her voice cold. "Fine, I'll tell you, but it's not going to change anything." Matthew leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Tell us everything." Sophia took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing. Evelyn was involved in something she shouldn't have been. She stumbled onto something big, a group of very powerful people doing very illegal things. She was supposed to disappear, but she got away. They've been looking for her ever since. Matthew's blood ran cold. "Who are they?" Sophia shrugged. "I don't know the details. I just know they don't stop." "And Claire? She's part of it too. They're after her because she knows things Evelyn told her." Angela's eyes widened. "What kind of things?" Sophia shook her head. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's dangerous. And now that you've found me, they're going to come after you too." Matthew's hands clenched into fists. "Where's Evelyn? Is she alive?" Sophia hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering with something. Regret? Maybe? "She's alive. For now. But if you want to save her, you're going to have to move fast. They're closing in, and when they do, there won't be anything left of her, or Claire." Matthew's chest tightened with fear and determination. He wasn't going to let that happen. Not to Evelyn, and not to Claire. He stood, his eyes hard. "Tell me where they are." Sophia shook her head. "I don't know, but if you want to find them, start with the people who are watching you." Matthew's blood turned to ice. "Watching me?" Sophia nodded, her expression grim. "They've been watching you since you started digging. They know you're close, and they're waiting for you to make a mistake." Matthew's heart raced. They had been followed, monitored, this entire time. Angela stood, her face set with determination. "Then we'll use that to our advantage. We'll draw them out." Sophia smirked, but it was a sad, resigned kind of smile. "Good luck. You're going to need it." As Matthew and Angela left the apartment, the weight of Sophia's words hung heavy between them. They were being watched, and time was running out. But now they had a plan, a way to draw out the people who had taken Evelyn, and they weren't going to stop until they brought her home. As Matthew and Angela drove back from Sophia's apartment, the weight of the conversation hung heavy between them. The car was filled with tense silence, both of them processing the revelations about Evelyn's disappearance and the dangerous people hunting her. Matthew's mind was racing. Every second felt like a countdown. Evelyn was alive, but for how long? And Claire, innocent, vulnerable Claire, was in the middle of a conspiracy she couldn't possibly understand. "We have to move fast," Angela said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm but filled with urgency. "If Sophia is right, they're watching us. We need to draw them out before they disappear again." Matthew nodded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. We use ourselves as bait. Force them to make a move. Angela glanced at him, worry flickering in her eyes. Are you sure about this? These people, they're not like anyone we've dealt with before. We don't know how far they'll go. I don't care, Matthew said, his voice hard. They have Evelyn. They've been after her for years. And now Claire's in danger too. I'm not letting them get away with this. Angela nodded, though the tension in her shoulders was palpable. Okay, but we have to be smart about it. If we're going to draw them out, we need to make sure we're ready for whatever happens. Matthew pulled the car into the orphanage parking lot, his mind already racing with a plan. He and Angela needed to set a trap, something that would force whoever was watching to reveal themselves. And they didn't have time to waste. They were getting closer to Evelyn, but the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. As they walked into the orphanage, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the building, Matthew's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from a blocked number. You're getting too close. Stop now, or you'll never see Evelyn again. Matthew's blood ran cold. They were already being watched. The threat was real, and it was immediate. He handed the phone to Angela, who read the message, her expression darkening. They're on to us, she said quietly. We need to act fast. Matthew's mind whirled as he tried to process the threat. Every instinct told him to charge forward, but he knew Angela was right. They needed a plan, a calculated move that would bring these people out of the shadows and into the light. I'll call my contact in law enforcement, Angela said, pulling out her phone. We can set up surveillance around the orphanage. If they're watching, we'll catch them. Matthew nodded, his heart racing. But as Angela stepped away to make the call, his thoughts kept returning to one person. Claire. She was the link between him and Evelyn, the innocent child caught in the middle of something much bigger than she could comprehend. And whoever was watching them wouldn't hesitate to use her to get what they wanted. He found Claire in the playroom, sitting quietly with her back to the door, drawing on a piece of paper. The stuffed rabbit, Evelyn's rabbit, was resting beside her. Matthew's chest tightened as he approached her, kneeling down to meet her gaze. Hey, Claire, he said softly. She looked up, her eyes wide and innocent, but there was a hint of recognition there. She knew something was wrong, even if she didn't fully understand it. Do you remember what we talked about? Matthew asked gently. About the lady who gave you the rabbit? Claire nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the crayon in her hand. Do you think you could tell me more about her? Did she say anything else? Claire hesitated, her eyes darting to the rabbit, then back to Matthew. She told me to be brave, she whispered. She said I'd be safe here. Matthew's heart clenched. Evelyn had been trying to protect Claire. She had left her in the safest place she could think of. But now the walls were closing in. The people who had taken Evelyn were coming for Claire next. And Matthew couldn't let that happen. Claire, I need you to stay close to Angela, okay? Matthew said, his voice calm but firm. Don't go anywhere without her. Promise me. Claire nodded, her expression serious. I promise. Matthew forced a smile, though his mind was racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. He had to be ready for whatever came next. By the time night fell, the orphanage was under watch. Angela's law enforcement contacts had set up discreet surveillance around the building, waiting for any sign of movement. Inside, the tension was palpable. Matthew paced the hallways, his mind on high alert, every sound making his pulse race. He didn't know what to expect. He only knew that something was coming. Angela found him near the entrance, her phone in hand. Everything's set, she said quietly. They're watching all the exits. If anyone tries to get close, we'll know. Matthew nodded, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. Do you think they'll come for her tonight? Angela's expression was grim. If they know we're onto them, they'll make a move soon. We just have to be ready. Matthew's phone buzzed again. Another message from the blocked number. You had your chance. Now it's over. Before he could react, the sound of a door slamming echoed through the hallway. Matthew's heart stopped. He and Angela exchanged a glance, and then they were both running, racing toward the source of the sound. They found the back door of the orphanage wide open, the night air cold and thick with tension. Matthew's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement, Any clue that would tell him what had happened. "Where's Claire?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. Angela's face went pale. She was with one of the staff. "I'll check." But before she could move, a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking the exit. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, his face hidden in the darkness. "You're too late," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. "She's already gone." Matthew's blood turned to ice. "Where is she?" The man smirked, taking a step closer. "You thought you could protect her? You thought you could save Evelyn? You don't even know who you're dealing with." Rage surged through Matthew, hot and blinding. He stepped forward, fists clenched. "Where is she?" The man's smile widened, but before he could respond, Angela was already on the phone, calling in backup. The sound of sirens in the distance cut through the night air, but the man didn't flinch. He glanced at Matthew, his expression calm, almost amused. "Evelyn made a mistake. She thought she could hide, but no one hides from us forever. And now it's your turn to lose." Matthew lunged at him, but the man was fast, slipping back into the shadows before he could grab him. By the time the backup arrived, he was gone, disappearing into the night like a ghost. Angela rushed to Matthew's side, her face pale. "Matthew, we'll find her. We'll find Claire." But Matthew's mind was spinning, his chest tight with fear and anger. Evelyn was still out there, and now Claire had been taken too. The people who had been hunting them for years were closing in, and Matthew was running out of time. "They've got Claire," Matthew said, his voice low, shaking with fury. "We need to find her. We need to end this." Angela nodded, her face set with determination. "We will, but we need a plan." Matthew's hands shook as he took a deep breath, forcing himself to think clearly. He had come too far to lose now. Whoever these people were, whoever had taken Evelyn and Claire, they were about to find out just how far he was willing to go. As they regrouped inside the orphanage, Matthew's phone buzzed one last time. Another message from the blocked number. "You want them back? Come find us. You know where." Matthew stared at the message, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew exactly where they were. And now, there was only one thing left to do. "We end this," he said, his voice hard with resolve. "Tonight." Angela met his gaze, her eyes filled with the same determination. "Let's go." Together, they headed into the night, ready to face the darkness that had been haunting them for so long. The city lights blurred as Matthew and Angela sped down the highway, the tension in the car thick enough to cut. The message on Matthew's phone was burned into his mind. You know where. There was only one place it could be, the abandoned factory just outside of town. It had been a ghostly presence for years, the kind of place people whispered about but rarely ventured near. Now, it was the setting for the final confrontation, the place where everything would come to a head. Matthew's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The weight of what was coming settled heavily on his chest. This was it, his chance to bring Evelyn home, to save Claire. There was no room for error. "We have to be careful," Angela said, her voice steady but low. "If they've been watching us this whole time, they'll be expecting us." "I know," Matthew replied, his jaw clenched. "But I'm done running. I'm done letting them control this." Angela nodded, but her eyes flickered with worry. "We'll get them back. Both of them." The factory loomed ahead, its silhouette dark and menacing against the night sky. Matthew's heart pounded in his chest as they pulled into the shadowed lot, parking the car out of sight. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant hum of the city. Matthew and Angela exchanged a glance, their unspoken determination hanging between them. "Let's do this," Matthew said, his voice low but filled with resolve. They moved quietly through the darkness, navigating their way toward the entrance. The factory was a maze of rusted steel beams and crumbling concrete, its once bustling machinery now long abandoned. Every step echoed in the emptiness. Every shadow felt like a threat lurking just out of sight. Matthew's pulse quickened as they approached the central chamber, the place where he knew they were waiting. He could feel it, could feel the eyes on him, the tension building. And then, as they rounded the corner, he saw them. Evelyn stood in the middle of the room, her hands bound behind her back, her face pale and drawn but alive. Claire was beside her, huddled close, fear etched into her young face. And surrounding them were the men, the ones who had been hunting them, the ones who had been pulling the strings all along. At their center stood the same man who had confronted Matthew at the orphanage, his smile cold and calculating. "You made it," the man said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I knew you wouldn't be able to resist." Matthew's breath hitched at the sight of his sister. She was thinner, her eyes haunted, but she was here, alive. "Let them go," he demanded, his voice tight with fury. "This ends tonight." The man chuckled, stepping forward with a smug grin. "You really think it's that simple? You have no idea what you've stumbled into." Matthew's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I don't care who you are. I don't care what this is about. You're not taking them." Angela moved beside him, her posture tense but ready. "You think you can just keep running? Whatever you're involved in, it's over. You've been exposed." The man's smile faltered for a moment, a flicker of anger crossing his face. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he sneered. "This isn't about running. This is about survival. Evelyn got in the way of something she shouldn't have, and now she's paying the price." Matthew's heart raced. "She was trying to protect us," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "She was trying to protect Claire." The man's eyes darkened, and he stepped closer, his expression hardening. "Evelyn knows too much. Claire is the key to everything. And you're just a pawn in a game you don't understand." Matthew's pulse quickened as he glanced at Evelyn, their eyes locking for the first time in years. He saw the fear in her gaze, but also the strength. The same strength she had shown all those years ago, the strength that had kept her alive. She shook her head subtly, as if telling him not to act, not to risk it. But Matthew couldn't stand by any longer. "I'm done playing your games," he growled. "Let them go, or you won't leave here." The man's smirk returned, but before he could respond, Angela moved. In a swift motion, she pulled out her phone and hit a button. Instantly, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, echoing through the factory. Backup was closing in, faster than anyone had expected. The man's smile disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating anger. "You think that's going to stop us?" he hissed. "You think you can win?" But Matthew didn't hesitate. With a surge of adrenaline, he lunged forward, tackling the man to the ground. They hit the concrete hard, the air knocked out of both of them. The man struggled beneath him, but Matthew's rage fueled his strength. He wasn't going to let this man take another person he loved. Angela rushed to Evelyn and Claire, quickly untying Evelyn's hands as the sound of the police grew closer. Evelyn stumbled forward, her legs weak from exhaustion, but she pulled Claire into her arms, holding her tight. "It's over," Angela said firmly, helping them to their feet. "You're safe now." Matthew pinned the man to the ground, his heart pounding in his ears. "Where is the rest of your group?" he demanded, his voice sharp with fury. "Where are they?" The man smirked up at him, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You can stop me, but there will always be more. You can't stop this." Matthew's eyes blazed with anger. "Watch me." Before the man could respond, the sound of footsteps filled the room as the police stormed in, guns drawn, ready to take down anyone who stood in their way. Angela stepped back, guiding Evelyn and Claire towards safety as the officers moved in, securing the scene. Matthew stood, his chest heaving, as the man was dragged away in handcuffs, still spitting threats and promises of revenge. But Matthew wasn't listening anymore. His focus was on Evelyn, on the sister he had fought so long to find, the sister he had never given up on. He walked toward her, his heart in his throat, and when she looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears, he pulled her into a tight embrace. The years of pain, of guilt, of searching all melted away in that moment. Evelyn was home. "I'm sorry," Evelyn whispered, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I just wanted to keep you safe." Matthew pulled back, looking into her eyes. You did everything you could. And now it's over." Angela approached, holding Claire's hand gently. "We'll get you both somewhere safe," she said, her voice filled with relief. "You don't have to run anymore." Claire looked up at Matthew, her small face filled with a mixture of fear and hope. Are we really safe now? Matthew knelt down, his heart swelling as he met her gaze. Yes, Claire, you're safe. And I'm going to make sure you stay that way. As the police cleared the scene and the night began to calm, Matthew felt the weight of years of pain and uncertainty finally lifting. Evelyn was alive, and Claire was safe. They had both survived the darkness that had hunted them for so long. And now, they had a chance to start over. As the sun began to rise on the horizon, casting a soft glow over the city, Matthew stood with Angela, Evelyn, and Claire by his side. They were battered, bruised, but alive. And for the first time in years, they were free. Matthew took a deep breath, the fresh morning air filling his lungs. This wasn't just the end of the nightmare. It was the beginning of something new.